this is the argument that I've had repeatedly with Mr. Putin, dating 5 years ago, at which time his suggestion, as I gather some Republicans are now suggesting, was, Assad's not so bad. Let him just be as brutal and repressive as he can, but at least he'll keep order. And I said, look, the problem is that the history of trying to keep order when a large majority of the country has turned against you is not good. And 5 years later, I was right. Sadly, had Assad made a decision earlier that he was not more important personally than his entire country, that kind of political transition would have been much easier. It's a lot harder now. But John Kerry's been doing some excellent work in moving that process forward, and I do think that you've seen from the Russians a recognition that after a couple of months, they're not really moving the needle that much, despite a sizable deployment inside of Syria. And of course, that's what I suggested would happen, because there's only so much bombing you can do when an entire country is outraged and believes that its ruler doesn't represent them.
According to an article written by The Week, dated December 12, 2021, a classified U.S. Special Operations cell that coordinated strikes against Islamic State targets showed reckless disregard for civilian casualties by regularly circumventing safeguard procedures and engaging in deceptive practices, according to a report published on Sunday by the New York Times. The special cell, known as Talon Anvil, reportedly worked around the clock in 3 shifts out of nondescript offices in Iraq and Syria, sorting through drone footage and on-the-ground intelligence from Kurdish and Syrian allies. Authority to order airstrikes either by Talon Anvil's owned armed drones or by manned aircraft was delegated to the highest-ranking enlisted U.S. Army Delta Force operator, then on duty, often a sergeant first class. Talon Anvil helped increase the volume of strikes against ISIS at a time when U.S. forces were struggling to engage at an effective pace, but high-ranking CIA and Air Force intelligence officers became skeptical of the cell's methods as civilian casualties mounted. Cell members reportedly misclassified almost all strikes as defensive in order to sidestep the rigorous vetting process imposed on offensive strikes, and even apparently took to averting the drone's cameras after launch in order to hide evidence of civilian deaths. One analyst claimed Talon Anvil strikes were killing civilians at a rate 10 times greater than that of similar operations in Afghanistan. General Stephen J. Townsend, who in 2016 and 2017 was the commander of Americans' offensive against ISIS and who implemented the policy of delegating strike authority to lower-ranking personnel, said civilian casualties were the result of the misfortunes of war, not of any recklessness or apathy on the part of himself or the troops under his command. That's the end of the article. And that's quite ironic, because what does the United States care about civilian casualties and civilian casualties as long as the greater political agenda and geopolitical agenda is achieved? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in order to understand why we're in Syria in the first place, let's go and read some documents and files and news articles in which I'll combine and give you a timeline of what was going on in Syria when the U.S. military decided to intervene. According to U.S. diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks, which have been seen as showing that regime change in Syria may have ultimately been a covert foreign policy goal of the U.S. government in the years leading up to the Civil War, and even during the period when President Barack Obama was publicly engaging with Syria's Bashar al-Assad. Remember, the reason why we went to the war in Syria was to defeat the jihadist extremists because we were conducting a war on terror in response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Now, according to a 2006 memorandum by U.S. diplomat William Roebuck, who is an American ambassador who served as the U.S. ambassador to Bahrain, of the embassy in Damascus, he stated, quote, "We believe Bashar's weaknesses are in how he chooses to react to looming issues, both perceived and real, such as the potential threat to the regime from the increasing presence of transitioning Islamist extremists." This cable summarizes our assessment of these vulnerabilities and suggests that there may be actions, stalemates, statements, and signals that the United States government can send that will improve the likelihood of such opportunities arising. These proposals will need to be fleshed out and converted into real actions, and we need to be ready to move quickly to take advantage of such opportunities. Many of our own suggestions underline using public diplomacy and more indirect means to send messages that influence the inner circle, end quote. Now, according to legendary independent reporter Seymour Hersh and the activist Robert Naiman, who is a foreign policy analyst and a writer, he was actually the former policy director at Just Foreign Policy. They went on to be charged affairs of the Libyan embassy under Obama and also considered the advantages of promoting religious sectarianism in Syria. But following the start of the Arab Spring in 2011, the protests in Syria against Assad were violently suppressed and a civil war began. And this is when the prisons were being released and some members of the Syrian army began to convert to the other side, in which they wanted to overthrow the Assad regime. I think this basically was led by the CIA, if you ask me, and the intelligence services, foreign intelligence, that had a wish to overthrow another democratically elected Arab government and to weaken the Arab League. But by 2012, there were several armed opposition groups operating in the country, including the Free Syrian Army, which was a loose faction in the army, whose goal is to bring down the Assad government. And they formed in July of 2011, and they were defectors from the Syrian armed forces. But just a couple of months later, the al-Nusra Front, which is an extremist group, which goes by Jabhat al-Nusra or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, was established by the Islamic State of Iraq as the official branch of al-Qaeda in Syria. The al-Nusra Front was eclipsed by its own creator, and al-Qaeda severed its ties to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And this was basically because they were killing Shia Muslims in the country. And also there was a power struggle that ended in 2014. Now, about this same time, a CIA operation, which was authorized by the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and was supported by Jordanian President King Abdullah II, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And it was codenamed Timber Sycamore. And I did a video about this, and you could look at that for a better introduction about the details of Timber Sycamore. But just to relate to you, at the direction of Barack Obama, of course, and the Central Intelligence Agency, Barack put the CIA in charge of operations regarding, I think it was $1 billion annually to arm the anti-government forces. Where am I getting that figure from? Well, I'm getting it from The Guardian, which was an October 8, 2015 article. The Washington Post entitled "Secret CIA Effort in Syria Faces Large Funding." The New York Times also wrote an October 12, 2015 article, wrote, U.S. weaponry is turning Syria into proxy war with Russia, which is another reason why. Now, this operation began formally in 2013, but we believe the operation was addressed to Obama in 2011, more than 2 years after the start of the Civil War. But prior to 2013, the CIA only supplied certain rebel groups of the Free Syrian Army with non-lethal aid, but they later began providing training, funding, and also even intelligence to rebel commanders. A former intelligence advisor, U.S. intelligence advisor, who spoke to Seymour Hersh, claimed that the CIA had been facilitating the flow of arms from Libya to Syria in collaboration with the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar since 2011. The first confirmed CIA weapons arrived in 2014. Another of the groups that was being armed was the Islamist Army of the Mujahideen, which formed in January 2014, which was specifically to combat the Islamic State in Levant. In addition to the covert CIA program, the U.S. House of Representatives voted to authorize the executive branch to overtly train and equip Syrian rebels against ISIL forces at a cost of $500 million on September 17, 2014. So this program basically was arming groups, proxy forces, jihadists, terrorists. You know, at around that same time, on Twitter in like 2014, 2015, you started noticing U.S. military personnel tweeting, whose side are we on? And why am I in a foxhole with a terrorist? I personally saw these tweets around that same time. Now, Seymour Hersh wrote an article, which I'm going to post in the description, and Seymour Hersh is highly recommended. To me, he's one of the best journalists in American history. And so I'm going to share the article with you. And the article is entitled Military to Military, Seymour Hersh on U.S. intelligence sharing in the Syrian Civil War. And it was written on January 7, 2016. I'm going to read you part of an article which goes to show you the nefarious agendas of the U.S. Of the White House in regards to covertly funding these groups, and how the Joint Special Operations Command and Special Forces conduct these raids, which tried to undermine the Assad government. Quote, there is also a parallel history of shadowy cooperation between Syria and the United States during this period. The two countries collaborated against al-Qaeda, the common enemy. A longtime consultant to the Joint Special Operations Command said that after 9/11, Bashar was, for years, extremely helpful to us, while, in my view, we were churlish in return and clumsy in our use of the gold he gave us. That quiet cooperation continued among some elements even after the Bush administration's decision to vilify him. In 2002, Assad authorized Syrian intelligence to turn over hundreds of internal files on the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and Germany. Later that year, Syrian intelligence foiled an attack by al-Qaeda on the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and Assad agreed to provide the CIA with the name of a vital al-Qaeda informant. In violation of this agreement, the CIA contacted the informant directly. He rejected the approach and broke off relations with his Syrian handlers. Assad also secretly turned over to the U.S. relatives of Saddam Hussein, who had sought refuge in Syria, and like Americans' allies in Jordan, Egypt, and Thailand, and elsewhere, tortured suspect terrorists for the CIA in a Damascus prison. Now, let me stop right there because this shows you that even in the early 2000s, well before the Arab Spring, well before U.S. military intervention in Syria, here we have the Assad government fighting against militant factions and even providing intelligence to the United States regarding Iraqi dissidents and Al-Qaeda. I think that's important. Let me read you more. Again, Hersh's article. By the late summer of 2013, the Defense Intelligence Agency assessment had been circulated widely, but although many in the American intelligence community were aware that the Syrian opposition was dominated by extremists, the CIA-sponsored weapons kept coming, presenting a continuing problem from Assad's army. Gaddafi's stockpile had created an international arms bazaar, though prices were high. There was no way to stop the arms shipments that had been authorized by the president, the Joint Special Operations Advisor said. The solution involved an appeal to the pocketbook. The CIA was approached by a representative from the Joint Chiefs with a suggestion that there were far less costly weapons available in Turkish arsenals that could reach the Syrian rebels within days and without a boat ride. But it wasn't only the CIA that benefited. We worked with Turks we trusted who were not loyal to Erdogan, the advisor said, got them to ship to jihadists in Syria all the obsolete weapons in the arsenal, including M1 carbines that had been sent and seen since the Korean War and lots of Soviet arms. It was a message Assad can understand. We have the power to diminish a presidential policy in its tracks. The flow of U.S. intelligence to the Syrian army and the downgrading of the quality of the arms being supplied to the rebels came at a critical juncture. The Syrian army had suffered heavy losses in the spring of 2013 in fighting against Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremist groups as it failed to hold the provincial capital of Raqqa. Sporadic Syrian army and Air Force raids continued in the area for months with little success until it was decided to withdraw from Raqqa and the hard to defend lightly populated areas in the north and west and focus instead on consolidating the government's hold on Damascus and the heavily populated areas linking the capital to Latakia in the northeast. You could see that the CIA started now supplying weapons through the use of the Turks and importing Turkish extremists to fight along the ranks of the dissidents of the Syrian army in the Free Syrian Army to help overthrow the Assad government. And I'll read more of the article. CIA efforts to train the moderate rebel forces were also failing badly. Also, I find that to be highly amusing, moderate rebel forces. The CIA training camp was in Jordan and was controlled by a Syrian rebel group, the JCS advisor said. There was a suspicion that some of those who signed up for training were actually Syrian army regulars minus their uniforms. This had happened before at the height of the Iraqi war when hundreds of Shia militia members showed up in an American training camp for new uniforms, weapons, and a few days of training, and then disappeared into the desert. A separate training program set up by the Pentagon in Turkey fared no better. The Pentagon acknowledged in September that only 4 or 5 of its recruits were still battling Islamic State. A few days later, 70 of them defected to Jabhat al-Nusra immediately after crossing the border into Syria. In January of 2014, despairing at the lack of progress, John Brennan, the director of the CIA, summoned American and Sunni Arab intelligence chiefs from throughout the Middle East to a secret meeting in Washington with the aim of persuading Saudi Arabia to stop supporting extremist fighters in Syria. The Saudis told us they were happy to listen. The Joint Chiefs of Staff advisors said. So everyone sat around in Washington to hear Brennan tell them that they had to get on board with the so-called moderates. His message was that if everyone in the region stopped supporting al-Nusra and ISIS, their ammunition and weapons would dry up and the moderates would win out. Brennan's message was ignored by the Saudis, the advisor said, who went back home and increased their efforts with the extremists and asked us for more technical support. Now, at the same time, you had President Obama, who is covertly funding moderate groups. They're actually extremist groups, right? Nothing moderate about these people. They're Salafi jihadists, killers, foreign Arabs trying to overthrow the Assad government with the help of the intelligentsia. Now, President Obama announced his intention to bomb Islamic State targets in Syria, and he also called on Congress to authorize a program to train and arm rebels who are fighting against the Islamic State in Levant and the Syrian forces of the Assad government. Now, this would link to the article that I read about regarding Seymour Hersh, in that these foreign Arabs who are coming from Turkey and the Gulf and Southeast Asia were being given the necessary tools, weapons, funding, training in camps in Turkey, in full support of the CIA, authorized by the Obama Obama administration. And what would happen, right? For the first time, Obama authorized direct attacks against the militant groups in Syria, but at the same time, he also gave the authorization to attack Assad's army. Now, it was around the same time in 2014 that the Russians opposed the U.S. intervention against U.S. intervention in Syria. And it was Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Alexander Lukashev who said on September 10, 2014, quote, this step in the absence of a UN Security Council decision would be an act of aggression, a gross violation of international law, end quote. And he would be right. But 7 days later, the US House of Representatives approved Obama's plan to train and arm the Syrian rebels in their fight against the Islamic State in Levant and the Assad government. To hell with international law. To hell with UN Security Council briefings. Let's give the White House, let's give the Department of Defense full authorization to conduct war whenever they want. Well, why not? On November 13th in 2001, the Bush White House said, the hell with US Geneva Conventions, to hell with the Department of Justice. We're going to be given full autonomy regarding who's a terrorist and who is not. That's right. And for those who tend to forget that it was the White House under their legal counsel led by John Yoo who rewrote or bypassed, let's put it honestly, the bypassing of international law, US law, and allowed the United States White House, the White House. At first it was the Department of Defense, but then it was rewritten and gave the president the full authority to deem who is a terrorist and who is not. It's a consolidation of power. That's what this is. That's why you have these special covert operations happening in countries like Syria and Iraq. The U.S. Special Operations Command is basically leading these covert operations with these killer groups, and they don't care about civilian casualties. And the operation to fund these extremist groups was ended in 2017 under the Trump administration. But the Trump administration in March of 2017 deployed an additional 400 U.S. Marines in Syria to expand the fight against the Islamic State Levant in the Raqqa offensive, where they could provide artillery support for U.S.-backed local forces that were preparing to take over Raqqa and liberate the city from the Islamic State, in which they did. And then right around the same time, we started seeing between 2015 and 2018, these false reports about chemical weapons, including the infamous Duma chemical attack, which was blamed on the Assad government, but actually they were human rights groups, including I'm forgetting the name of the group that was in charge of the investigation of the Duma chemical attack. And the Duma chemical attack, I think, killed like 50 people, in which a report was issued by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. That nerve agents were in the chemicals. But there was a number of different reports that came out and contradicting to it. That said that it wasn't from the Assad government. Aaron Mate does a great job showing this, and he got highly criticized for it. But he's one of the better independent journalists out there. And by December of 2018, Donald Trump announced that he ordered the pullout of 3,000 U.S. troops. This is what made Trump very unlikely as a popular president, because he went against the Pentagon's wishes to stay in Libya, to stay in Syria, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. And Trump didn't want too much personnel in Syria. And he was the one who authorized the original pullout of Afghanistan. However, with the rise of the extremists coming from U.S. aerial bombings from drones, which have killed tens of thousands of civilians, and we're seeing reports of this now more than ever, we're creating more terrorists. People's entire families are killed. They have nothing to live for. The war on terror is a farce. And now the reason why we're in Syria is basically to destroy any influence of the Iranian military, Hezbollah, the pro-militant groups like the Kataib Hezbollah, which is a Shiite paramilitary group, which are fighting against the Syrian jihadists on behalf of the Assad government. That's the only reason why we're there. That and the oil. I think it was Trump that basically said that when we took over the oil reserves in Damascus, he said we're not giving it back. So these U.S. proxy conflicts now, which are not about the war on terror, but it's war on getting rid of a preconceived enemy for Israel, because Israel considers Hezbollah its ultimate enemy, as well as the Gulf. Can't forget about them. But they see it differently. They see it as a religious war. Israel just sees it as a an enemy, an Arab enemy that needs to be destroyed. And the Shia themselves are better fighters than the Arabs. Much more organized, much more rugged, resilient, and vigilant. And they don't have they're not militants in the way that that groups like Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamic State, or Boko Haram and Abu Sayyaf, they don't have groups like that where they'll just conduct terrorist attacks on civilians. And, you know, the national media, as well as Israel and the Gulf, they'll tell you otherwise. Oh, they'll say that Hezbollah or Iran, this is a funny one, that Iran is the greatest exporter of international terrorism in the world. Meanwhile, we're allied with the country that is the largest exporter and importer of terrorism in the world, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. But it doesn't stop with Trump. You know, under President Obama earlier this year in February, he destroyed multiple facilities relating to pro-Iranian militias under the Hezbollah and the Saeed al-Shahuda, which is a Shia militia. And their stated goal is to put an end to the sectarian conflict. That sounds like a goal to me. Why are we bombing these people? Why aren't we supporting these people? Why aren't we going to the U.S. House of Representatives and giving these people $500 million to defeat the final remnants of Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra? Well, it doesn't stop there. And Biden authorized the U.S. military to conduct airstrikes in June of 2021 on facilities purportedly used by Iranian-supported militias. And as of recent, on October 20th, Iranian proxy forces were bombed, in which the Pentagon spokesman John Kirby called a complex, coordinated, deliberate attack on Iranian proxy forces. Don't bomb the Islamic State. Don't bomb them for a little bit. Say you're fighting the war on terror. No, let's kill the people who are killing, who actually are doing better than the United States. You know, it's Russia who basically saved Syria from the Islamic State and Levant, and the resiliency of the Syrian army. Now, you have a whole bunch of civilian casualties and war crimes that goes back to 2013. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the Aleppo Media Center, and the Local Coordination Committee, which reports over the years the United States bombing using drone strikes Drone strikes are the worst. On alleged Islamic State positions, but these are homes and businesses that are under the control of ISIL, and they're just killing the civilians. And, you know, this is twofold, because not only does it help Islamic State, when they bomb these civilian areas, because they could just go to the civilians and say, you see, they are not your friend, they're your enemy. Join us. Amnesty International, which there was a joint investigation by Amnesty International in 2019, and Air Wars. Air Wars is a London nonprofit company that tracks and archives the international air war against the Islamic State, Syria, Libya, and Iraq. That over 200 airstrikes killed 1,600 civilians in the year 2017. The Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve reported in that month of April of 2017 that its 4-year operations over both Iraq and Syria amounted to 1,257 casualties, including civilians. However, by April of 2021, Air Wars estimated that 13,188 civilian deaths in Iraq and Syria were due to specifically coalition airstrikes from drones, in which 2,362 of them were children. And that's coming from the report. And, you know, I'll provide that for you in the description. But I mean, what do we need to do at this point? Well, I think what we need to do is pretty obvious. What we need to do is reevaluate U.S. foreign policy, because at this point, it's not being directed by the people. It's being directed by the Department of Defense and the White House and our foreign lobby institutes and the lobbyists themselves and private military industrialists. Because if we had a say in it, we wouldn't be in Syria in the first place.